Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for coming. I'm Steve Pitti. I'm a professor of history and American studies and director of the Center for the Study of Race, Indigeneity, and Transnational Migration here at Yale. Thank you, everybody, for turning out for this wonderful opportunity to hear from one of my very favorite scholars, Professor Raquel Minian of Stanford University. I want to thank Nandy Cummings and others at the RITM Center for helping to put this event together and making all of this possible. Raquel Minian is assistant professor of history at Stanford. She received her BA degree from the University of Chicago, and then her master's and her PhD, the latter in 2012, from Yale's American Studies program here in New Haven. Her dissertation, which is the basis for her tremendous book from which she's speaking today, and which you can see pictured on the screen next to me, received in 2012 the Ralph Henry Gabriel Prize as the best dissertation written in American studies, in the field of American studies, in that year. Anna, as you'll see today, is a top scholar of US history and of Mexican history, especially in the late 20th century, and to my mind, is the finest historian of Mexican migration working today. She's published in the Journal American Quarterly, in the Journal of American History, in places like the Washington Post and elsewhere. She's also made other important media appearances in recent months, talking about issues related to Mexican migration and migration in Mexico. Her book, Undocumented Lives, published just months ago by Harvard University Press in 2018, explores the late 20th century history of Mexican undocumented migration to the United States, the growth of migrant communities in the United States, and binational efforts in the late 20th century to regulate the US-Mexico border. Anna, in writing this history, relies upon an incredible set of sources, of primary sources, many of which she's the first to use as a scholar. She did over 200 oral histories to do this project. She worked with government archives. She captured migrant correspondence, letters, and also used privately held organizational records and personal collections, pamphlets and unpublished ephemera, and newspapers and magazines collected in places like Washington, D.C., Chicago, the San Francisco Bay Area, Los Angeles, Michoacán, Zacatecas, and Mexico City. What she crafted is really the first sustained history of transnational Mexican migration from roughly the year 1965 to 1986. And what she does in this book, Undocumented Lives, should, I think, reset how we talk about the recent histories of both Mexico and the United States, indeed of governments, of everyday people, of migrants and of non-migrants, of what it means to be a wage earner, of what it means to be a family member, a citizen, a queer subject, and much, much more. Now, in the academy, people like me aren't supposed to have favorites or favorite books, but this book and this scholar, the book at least, belongs on the short list, the small shelf, I think, of most important books published on these subjects and on other subjects. It's one that's deserving of all of our attention and many more people's attention. And to Anna's great credit, she's written this in engaging prose and lively prose in ways that should engage a popular audience and deserve to find their way to a popular audience. So please join me in welcoming Raquel Minian back to campus.
Well, with that, I don't know what else to say. Like, I was blushing. It was the nicest introduction I've ever received. It is a real honor to be here to present my work with the Center of the Study of Race, Indigeneity, and Transnational Migration. When I was at Yale, this center did not exist, and it's really incredible that it is here now. I want to especially thank Nandy Cummings and Steve Pitti for organizing my visit. This book started, as Steve was saying, as a dissertation here at Yale. And it might be the most exciting moment of my career to come back in order to talk about it as a book now here. Approximately 40% of all Mexicans from the state of Zacatecas now reside in the United States. Similarly, 1/3 of all of those from the state of Guanajuato now live north of the border. And slightly more Michoacanos, those from the state of Michoacán, now work in the fields of California, Oregon, and Illinois than the number of Michoacanos who still reside in their home state. Latinos have become the largest minority group in the United States, constituting approximately 18% of the population. There are an estimated 11 million undocumented migrants, half of them from Mexico, now residing here. The sheer number of Mexicans who migrated to the United States and their importance in politics, economics, and daily social relations means that their stories have shaped both Mexican and U.S. national histories. Yet few historians have paid attention to the causes and effects of Mexican migration in Mexico, and even fewer have examined how this phenomenon affected life in both countries, creating strong transnational relations between them. Incorporating these dimensions changes our understandings of both migration and of U.S.-Mexico relations more broadly. My book, Undocumented Lives, The Untold Story of Mexican Migration, examines this history in the post-war years. It does so by using sources that come from the national archives of both countries, by using migrants' personal collections, which included sources such as the love letters that migrants sent to their communities back home and the records of their meetings, and by using over 250 oral history interviews that I conducted on both sides of the border with people who came from communities from the states of Michoacán and Zacatecas, which I pointed out at the beginning, which were some of the states of highest out-migration. Using these sources, I examine how unauthorized Mexican migration became an entrenched phenomenon in the years between 1965 and 1986. I use these two dates as bookends to my book because they mark important turning points in the history of migration. Up until 1964, Mexico and the United States had a bilateral program through which Mexican workers could come as guest workers and work legally for short periods of time. In 1964, the United States unilaterally ends this program, which was called the Bracero Program. As a result, the following year, in 1965, Mexican workers who are accustomed to coming here and working find themselves that they can no longer come to the United States legally. But their conditions in Mexico haven't changed, and so they continue coming. They simply do so without papers. Still, their migration is for the most part circular. Workers come, work here for short periods of time, return to Mexico, and then repeat this process. This pattern of circular migration ended in 1986 when the U.S. Congress passed the Immigration Reform and Control Act. One of the main clauses of this law was border fortification. The act allotted a lot of money to increase the size of the Border Patrol and surveillance technologies across the border. As it became harder for people, for Mexicans to cross the border without papers, they decided to come and settle permanently because they could no longer continue to risk going back and forth now that the border was so much harder to cross. The years between 1965 and 1986 were ones in which many of the current dilemmas around undocumented migration were born. This period saw the unprecedented rise of unauthorized Mexican migration. Apprehensions by the Immigration and Naturalization Service, otherwise known as the INS, rose from 55,000 in 1965 to over 1.5 million by 1986. This is over a 3,000% overall increase. This period also saw key shifts in the government policies of both countries with regard to migration. And perhaps more important, it was during this period that Mexican people's consciousness shifted toward an acknowledgement that their future depended on undocumented migration. Because of time constraints, I will not be able to touch on every aspect that I talk about in my book. Instead, I will focus on talking about the broad arguments that I make through the question of welfare. I do so because the question of welfare, alongside with ones of gender, sexuality, and geographical space, because welfare is one of the main threads that runs throughout the book, alongside with those other threads. Now, focusing on welfare, today I will discuss two of the main points that I make in my book. First, I argue that during the 1970s, working class men faced exclusionary pressures to leave both Mexico and the United States. Now, that migrants are excluded from the United States seems, especially nowadays, almost intuitive. But that Mexicans were excluded from Mexico is much more surprising. It means that migrants faced a double exclusion from the two countries where they lived. This double exclusion was enacted both by the government officials of Mexico and the United States, as well as by migrants' own communities. Let me explain this point a bit further. In Mexico, the government's top policymakers concluded that because the nation could no longer afford to act as a welfare state, because the Mexican economy was starting to decline, it had to find a way to reduce unemployment. And one of the ways to do so was to encourage people to emigrate. On the other side of the border, in the United States, migrants started to find themselves accused of draining welfare, and they were regularly deported. Migrants' own communities started to reject migrants' presence in either Mexico or the United States on a permanent basis. Increasingly, migrants found that they could belong nowhere, that they could live on a permanent basis, neither in the United States nor in Mexico. They started to claim that they were from neither here nor there, ni de aquí, ni de allá. Now, my second argument is that during this period, migrants advanced their own visions of where they belong. By doing so, they countered their double exclusion from Mexico and the United States. In particular, I focus on how they created groups in Los Angeles that provided economic security for migrants in the United States, as well as for Mexican citizens who remained in Mexico. By guaranteeing that those back home had their basic needs satisfied, I argued, these migrants' organizations started to act as a type of extraterritorial welfare state. Through this activism, migrants managed to become central players in regional, national, and transnational politics. Now, to make these two arguments today, I will first show how the US government, then the Mexican government, and then Mexican communities used ideas of welfare to deny migrants the right to settle permanently in any place. I will then move on to show how, by creating welfare organizations, migrants manage to create their own cartographies of belonging. Let's start in the United States, where one of the main rallying cries against unauthorized Mexicans, starting in the 1970s, was that they were draining the nation's welfare coffers. During this decade of economic crisis, the US economy saw the rapid rise of unemployment and inflation simultaneously. The expansion of welfare came to be seen as an urgent national problem, and people of color were often accused for draining welfare. Newspapers often blame the quote-unquote black, promiscuous, Cadillac-driving welfare queen for the expansion of welfare. This has led historians to focus strictly on the cultural associations between black people and welfare abuse. Yet the majority of newspaper articles that talked about the problems created by Mexican migrants also referred to their use of public aid and services. Articles came out with titles such as Illegal Aliens Here, called Public Services Burden, and Welfare System, a Haven for Illegal Aliens. Mexicans tried to counter these stereotypes by blaming US-born Mexican Americans for the existing associations between Mexicans and welfare abuse. For instance, Agapito Rodriguez, who migrated from Zacatecas, held that everyone in the migrant community believed that it was US-born Mexican Americans who were abusing welfare. Among his friends, he claimed Mexican Americans were seen, quote, as lazy people. We, migrants, would go to work, but those people generally did not work, but instead survived from welfare. This commonly used strategy of shunning other marginalized groups did not help undocumented migrants, who continued to be associated with abusing public welfare. These associations were particularly unsuitable because unauthorized migrants were ineligible for public welfare, and few dared to apply for aid illegally. At least 6 different field studies published at the time found that unauthorized Mexican migrants rarely used public support, such as unemployment compensation, welfare assistance, or food stamps. This meant that Mexican migrants were simultaneously accused of draining public resources and at the same time prevented from applying for welfare. Still, one of the main arguments heard in Congress against undocumented migrants was, of course, that they drained welfare. In 1976, those who wanted to limit the number of Mexicans in the United States had a clear victory with the passage of the Western Hemisphere Act. This act established an annual quota of 20,000 immigrants per nation from countries in the Western Hemisphere, a clause that affected Mexico in particular, as it was the only country with an immigration rate much higher than 20,000 per year. The passage of the bill was defended in part through arguments such as those of Senator Thurmond of South Carolina, who argued that, quote, in many cases, these illegal entrants and their families soon become a welfare burden on our society, supported in one way or another by American taxpayers. Arguments that Mexican migrants drained welfare did not simply affect the marking of the border through legislative means. They also encouraged the INS to increase the number of raids that it was conducting in Latino communities. In June 1973, Donald T. Williams, then acting director of the INS, explained the increasing number of raids by stating, immigrants attend schools at taxpayers' expense. They take jobs that normally would go to Americans, and many of them go on welfare and use other public social services. So, notions of welfare played a significant role in pushing migrants out of the United States by encouraging US officials to introduce legislative changes to immigration law and by encouraging them to conduct more raids against undocumented workers. Although Mexicans kept crossing the border and living in the United States, policymakers accused them of being outsiders who drained welfare. Now let me turn to the case of Mexico. Like US officials, during the 1970s, Mexican officials also started to reject migrants' presence in their country. The Mexican government had a very different rhetoric on welfare than did US policymakers. After the Mexican Revolution, the ruling party, the PRI, established itself as the promoter of a Mexican welfare state. But even though the government legitimized itself through claims that it was a welfare state, it failed to ensure the economic well-being of its citizens. Up until the mid-1970s, Mexican policymakers had long considered that to achieve a welfare state and accelerate economic growth, they had to pursue population growth policies. In fact, since Mexico's independence, Mexican officials had tried to increase the number of people who resided in the country in order to accelerate the country's economic development. Now, in terms of migration, what this meant, of course, was encouraging those who had already migrated, those who were already in the United States, to return to Mexico, while discouraging others who were still in Mexico from going abroad. In the mid-1970s, Mexico's top politicians started to change their position, in part because of a collapsing economy. During these years, the balance of payment ran a huge deficit, and consumer prices doubled. Before leaving office in 1976, President Luis Echeverría was forced to devalue the peso, ask for assistance from the IMF, and accept its austerity package. Mexican officials debated how to solve the nation's economic problems. Should they continue to expand the welfare system even further? Should they start to change their position? Ultimately, they concluded that population growth was no longer advantageous. If anything, Mexico's population had to be reduced. One way to do so was by accepting, and sometimes even by encouraging, citizens' emigration to the United States. Now, existing government archives contain limited explicit evidence in which policymakers openly acknowledge changing their views on immigration as a way of alleviating Mexico's economic problems. Speaking of such a change would have meant recognizing that the PRI was giving up on the revolution's welfare goals of providing Mexicans with the means of residing with humane living standards in their country of birth. It would have also meant acknowledging that the government rejected the presence of some citizens in the national territory, and that officials had started to favor their departure to a country where they were viewed primarily as illegal aliens. Despite the paucity of such explicit evidence, the jumbled changes in state practices that occurred between the mid-1960s to the mid-1980s elucidate politicians' changing positions. Let me give you a couple of examples that illustrate how they went from discouraging unauthorized migration to viewing it as necessary. First, from the mid-1940s to the mid-1970s, Mexican and US migratory officials had coordinated mechanisms to repatriate deportees deep into the interior of Mexico. These officials knew that if they released the deportees near the border region, these migrants would simply cross over to Mexico the following day. So the mechanism they introduced worked like this. When immigration officials in the United States caught unauthorized migrants, they would take them to the US-Mexico border, and they would then hand them to Mexican officials from the Mexican Department of Migration. This Department of Migration was then in charge of taking the migrants away from the border and deep into the Mexican interior. And here we can see officials from Mexico's Departamento de Migración, Department of Migration, and a group of men that has been apprehended and is about to board on a train to take them into the interior of Mexico. Now, in the mid-1970s, when Mexican officials started to look favorably on immigration, they stopped attempting to take deportees away from the border and into the Mexican interior. This change began in 1976, when US officials wanted to sign a $2 million contract with Mexican officials to be able to send deportees by plane into the Mexican interior. The Mexican government, for the first time, refused to give these companies permission to work. The government officials claimed that the deportees had the quote-unquote constitutional right to stay in northern Mexico if they so desired. Now let me point that before this point, those constitutional rights didn't seem to matter. Another example of politicians changing position is that by the mid-1970s, they started to work on defending the rights of undocumented migrants in the United States. Such attempts to protect Mexicans in the United States are not mentioned in government documents until after Mexico's top politicians changed their position with regard to immigration. The Migratory Worker Archives, which are all the archives that document the instances in which consuls assisted Mexican workers who lived in the United States, as well as Mexican National Archives, all indicate that the concern over undocumented migrants' rights did not begin until the late 1970s, when Mexican officials had started to view immigration favorably. On the contrary, existing government documents show how, before the mid-1970s, Mexican officials insisted that Mexicans who migrated illegally lost their right to protection as a result of their unauthorized migration. This strategy, which they communicated to Mexican workers, comes out in the correspondence that they sent to workers, such as in the letters that government officials sent to Epifanio Quintin. On September 30, 1968, Quintin's son died from asphyxiation after his smugglers left him in a hermetically closed U-Haul truck. For Quintin's family, the tragedy was compounded by their poverty. As Epifanio Quintin explained to the Mexican consul in San Antonio, he could not support his wife and his son's children with the 5 daily pesos that he made as an ice cream vendor. Quintin requested that the government allow one of his other sons to go to the United States as a bracero. Government officials replied that they could not allow Quintin's other sons to go to the United States as braceros because the Bracero Program had officially ended. But they then added that they, quote, considered it convenient to emphasize that Quintin's sons not abandon their residence without the existence of a legally authorized work contract, as they would otherwise expose themselves to leaving the country without the protection of the law and would run the risks to which those who break such laws are exposed. Before the mid-1970s, officials insisted that migrants lost their right to protection as a result of their unauthorized migration. In contrast, by the mid-1970s, government officials repeatedly informed migrants of their aims to defend them. In 1978, for instance, the government publicly announced the opening of the first office for the protection of undocumented workers living in the United States. This new interest in the human rights of Mexicans who resided in the United States is particularly surprising given the government's blatant disregard for the rights of citizens who still resided in Mexico. As Human Rights Watch noted, since the late 1960s and early 1970s, an array of abuses have become an institutionalized part of Mexican society, including killings, torture, and abuses against independent unions. Officials' interest in the human rights of citizens in the United States and their concurrent lack of concern for them while in Mexico was related to their belief that many Mexican citizens ought to live north of the border. After Mexican officials changed their views regarding migration, they also openly attempted to convince the United States to allow undocumented migrants to reside there. They even did so by fanning out Cold War fears. For example, in 1979, Mexico's Secretary of Foreign Relations, Jorge Castañeda, asserted that the United States was not giving Mexico special consideration when it came to immigration. Given that the United States was not giving Mexico this special consideration, Castañeda said, Mexico would start looking to Latin America as well as to, quote, Europe, Japan, the socialist countries. In this not-so-veiled threat, he impressed upon the United States how important immigration was for Mexico's government. Before I continue, up to now I have been arguing that during the 1970s, ideas of welfare pushed forward the view that Mexicans did not belong in the United States. These notions encouraged US government officials to deport more Mexicans and made it harder for Mexican migrants to enter the United States. During this same decade, Mexican authorities themselves started to reject the presence of migrants in Mexico. While the Mexican government had previously attempted to act as a welfare state and continued to portray itself as such, by the mid-1970s, Mexican officials believed that the way forward was to encourage working-class citizens to live in a country that viewed them as illegals. Now that I have examined how migrants experienced a double exclusion from Mexico and the United States because of the pressures enacted by both governments, let me turn to the pressures migrants faced from their own communities. At the local level, migrants' families and friends also started to deny them the ability to reside permanently in either country. Because the Mexican government failed to act as a true welfare state on which people could rely in time of need, families and communities started to pressure married men to head north to support them. Antonio Cordova, from the town of Sinsunzan, Michoacan, recalls that before he started migrating, he went to meet with government officials to ask them for credit to buy oxen. According to Cordova, if he had received this credit and had been able to buy oxen, he would have been able to avoid going north, which he did not want to do. But he recalls that these officials just said, go, I'll examine your case on this date or that date, but they never did anything. Without prospects for jobs and nowhere to turn for help, Cordova knew that he would have to migrate. His own family members insisted that he go to the United States to support them. Now, from this example, you might have already picked up that unauthorized migration and the pressures people felt to migrate had a profound gender dimension. These gender dynamics often had unexpected effects. In Mexican communities, Mexican men bore the pressures to migrate to support their families. Although some women also migrated to work, during the years between 1965 and 1986, it was mostly men who migrated, and the community pressure to do so fell almost strictly on them. After all, it was extremely expensive for whole families to go north, in part because of smugglers' fees. Divisions of labor within the family led people to believe that men ought to go north for work in the United States, while women remained at home taking care of the children. As Maria Reyes from Nochistlán, Zacatecas recalls, I thought about migrating, but I couldn't because of my many children. I was tired of being alone while my husband was in the United States. I would tell him, take me with you. And he would say, how can I take you with me? First, where would we stay? We're too many. Second, how can I take you when it's so hard to cross over? Like most women, Reyes never considered asking her husband to look after their children while she migrated and remitted money for the family. Women were also discouraged from migrating because of sexual violence at the border. Horrifying stories of the dangers that women faced circulated throughout Mexican towns, discouraging many women from attempting their luck in El Norte. For example, in the town of Ruiz Cortines, Michoacan, women warned each other about the dangers of going to the United States by telling the story of one particular villager whose smuggler had sexually abused her, and according to them, her life had since been ruined. While women were discouraged from heading to the United States, men felt pressured to do so. Significantly, it was women in their roles as wives and mothers who were the main people who pushed men to migrate. For instance, Eloisa Garza from Nochistlán, Zacatecas, recalls that like many women, she insisted that her husband migrate to provide for their family's welfare because he had to go to make money to support us. He had to work to be able to provide us with food because in Mexico, life is very hard. Her husband's parents and friends also pushed him to go. The staggering rates of male migration left many men feeling inadequate if they did not go to the United States to provide for their families. Migrating to ensure their family's welfare became a way to establish one's manhood. Rafael Ruano recalls that, like many other men, he migrated with 3 friends who pressured each other into taking the journey. Had Ruano not migrated, he would have felt cowardly, he says, and would have been ridiculed. Community pressure changed the way many men felt about the space of their hometown. In oral history interviews, they regularly described the pressures they faced to head north as if their hometowns were shrinking around them and squeezing them out. As Ricardo Perez explained, everyone expected me to leave and come back with money. I felt like I couldn't remain in town without going to the United States. But once in the United States, men felt that their loved ones, the very people who had pressured them to go north in the first place, now prevented them from residing there permanently. Once men were abroad, their wives, children, and parents regularly pressured them to return home. Everardo Camacho, for instance, recalls that his wife and daughter constantly reproached him for leaving them alone too much during his stays abroad. From the United States, men would receive letters from their families begging them to return home soon. Up to now, I have shown how men came to see their communities in the United States as places where they could only reside in temporarily, and their hometowns as spaces that shrunk around them and squeezed them out. It is important to note, however, that women also saw their sense of space diminish as a result of men's migration. After going to the United States, men started to fear that their wives, who remained in Mexico, would cheat on them, and so started to prohibit them from socializing outside the home. According to Ana Beltrán, who lived in Santa Fe de la Laguna, Michoacán, villagers often gossiped about women who socialized outdoors, and they claimed that they were being unfaithful to their husbands. Because rumors of infidelities often reached El Norte, women started to fear that if they went outside of their homes too much and rumors spread that they were cheating on their husbands, the men would stop sending them money. As such, many women started to avoid going outside as much as possible. Migration is often associated with a sense of cosmopolitanism and an opening of people's worlds. But when it came to unauthorized Mexican migration, both men and women saw their sense of space diminish in significant ways as a result of men's migration. Let me summarize what I have been saying up to now about the pressures migrants experienced on both sides of the border. Migrants faced a double exclusion that prevented them from residing in Mexico and the United States. This exclusion was enforced by government officials from both countries, as well as by their own families and friends. Mexico's leaders viewed migrants as economically superfluous and favored their departures from Mexico. US officials came to consider migrants as draining welfare resources and regularly deported them from the United States. Migrants' own communities rejected their presence in either country by holding that their own welfare depended on migrants' remittances and return visits. Now, in this context, migrants sought to assert their local, regional, and national belonging by creating their own welfare organizations. To demonstrate this, I'm going to focus on the activism of Mexican nationals in Los Angeles. One of the main migrant institutions that worked to help other migrants during these years was the Comité de Beneficencia Mexicana, often referred to in English as the Mexican Welfare Committee. When one examines the applications for relief that the Comité received, a paradox regarding welfare soon becomes clear. As we have seen, U.S. anti-immigrant practices were often influenced by the rhetoric that Mexicans abused welfare. But these exclusionary practices themselves were often responsible for driving migrants into seeking aid. For example, in 1970, immigration officials detained 24-year-old Ubaldo Rosas to deport him back to Mazatlan, Sinaloa. On the train ride south, the officers beat him up and confiscated his belongings. Fearing for his safety, Rosas jumped from the train, but he miscalculated the distance and fell on the rails. The train severed both legs and 2 fingers from his left hand. Rosas came to require a wheelchair. He couldn't afford to buy it himself, so he solicited aid, but not from U.S. state resources, but from the Comité de Beneficencia Mexicana. Border enforcement led Rosas to seek welfare aid, yet rather than resorting to U.S. state resources, Rosas depended on the support of other migrants. The Comité provided him with the financial support and wheelchair he needed. The Comité became so influential that Mexican consuls and even the LAPD sent Mexican nationals to seek aid from this organization. In other words, migrants became central players in providing each other with their basic necessities in the United States. The Comité raised money primarily by renting out a building it owned called La Casa del Mexicano. And this is a picture of how La Casa del Mexicano looked. By the mid-1970s, the main groups that rented out La Casa were clubes sociales, often known by their contemporary term of hometown associations. These clubs worked to send funds across the border to develop their communities in Mexico. As a result, they acted very differently from the mutual aid societies that most historians have analyzed, which worked to support migrants within the United States. Instead, clubes sociales, I argue, acted as a type of extraterritorial welfare state. From the United States, clubs took on the role of the Mexican government and sought to ensure the welfare of all Mexicans. Activists themselves have this interpretation. In his unpublished memoirs, Raúl Villarreal, who was one of the main club activists, recalls that his story is one of a simple dishwasher from a Los Angeles restaurant who, by working in clubes sociales, ended up helping the people of Mexico more than the government itself. These groups started as very small organizations. In 1962, a group of migrants who was living in Los Angeles, but who came from the small Mexican rancho of Guadalupe Victoria, which is located in the state of Zacatecas, decided to start raising funds to send money back home. And here you have a list of the first members of this organization. And you can see it's not very big. There's very few members. They're each donating $1 each at a time. This was a very small-scale operation to begin with. However, migrants from other communities in Mexico soon followed the example of the Club Social Guadalupe Victoria. And by the mid-1970s, a large community developed in Los Angeles around the idea of sending aid to Mexico. The club culture that took shape in La Casa del Mexicano revolved around dances that happened every weekend and which had approximately 350 attendees. Parties began at 8 p.m. and ended at 2 a.m. As they rode on, people would laugh, dance, and converse until the music ended. Once the parties finished, migrants left with a renewed sense of community and belonging, the hosting club with a profit of approximately $600. Club members sent the money they collected to local agents in Mexico who were in charge of managing the funds. For example, the Club Social Guadalupe Victoria remitted the money migrants fundraised to club agents residing in the rancho. These agents then distributed it to the elderly on a weekly basis. As the club developed, it started to take on bigger and bigger projects. By 1987, the club had also paved the rancho's main street, fenced its school, set up electric power lines, brought potable water, and built a clinic. And this is a picture of how the clinic looks today. In other words, migrants in the United States raised money, and club representatives in Mexico ensured that it was appropriately distributed. Together, they formed a welfare system that guaranteed that the rancho's basic necessities were met. Migrants felt that their families and friends prevented them from settling in either their hometowns or in their new communities. But through their club activisms, migrants managed to become central figures in both these locales. From the United States, migrants changed the built environment and living conditions in Mexico. When people walked through paved streets, attended clinics, or even flipped on and turned their light switches, they had to think about migrants' contributions. The very meaning of hometown became imbued with migration. Similarly, by creating long-lasting spaces where they could gather in the United States, migrants managed to build a community north of the border despite the impermanence of their individual stays there. Club members realized that they were taking on responsibilities that were traditionally assumed by the state, but they argued that if they did not, the Mexican government would not either. As Gregorio Casillas explained, the government wasn't interested. For example, it's the government's obligation to provide what the community needs, like electric lights, clinics, schools. But unfortunately, they didn't do it, so we had to intervene. From the 1960s to the mid-1970s, the Mexican government ignored clubs. Finally, in 1986, Zacatecas Governor Genaro Borrego realized that given the huge impact that migrants had on the state, he could not continue to ignore club activities. That year, he agreed to develop a program by which the state government would match every dollar that migrant organizations sent to Zacatecas for the betterment of their communities. This agreement marked the first time that migrants were granted official recognition by a state government. In 1999, the Mexican government began the Programa 3x1, 3-for-1, by which federal, municipal, and state governments all give $1 for every dollar clubs send for the betterment of communities. In 1986, the year that Borrego got involved with club activities, the U.S. Congress passed the Immigration Reform and Control Act, which further fortified the U.S.-Mexico border. By then, however, undocumented migration had already become a self-perpetuating phenomenon. Migrants such as those involved in clubs had learned that through their migration, they could at least acquire partial national and local belonging in the multiple spaces in which they lived. Because crossing the border became increasingly dangerous after 1986, men started refraining from circular migration and instead encouraged their whole families to cross the border once and relocate permanently in the United States. They did not dare head back to Mexico for fear that they would not be able to cross back north again. Now, rather than feeling pushed out of all the places in which they lived and having a sense of themselves as being from neither here nor there, migrants now started to feel entrapped in the United States, which they came to refer to as la jaula de oro, or the golden cage. My talk has focused on how, in the years between 1965 and 1986, migrants faced a double exclusion from Mexico and the United States, but also how they managed to assert their own cartographies of belonging through their activism. Among other issues, my book also examines how queer men were the only ones who could refrain from migrating. It examines the other types of transnational activism in which migrants engaged, and it analyzes the broader economic developments that shaped the policies of both countries. As such, I offer a transnational perspective of the history of Mexican migration and the growth of Latino communities. As a conclusion to today's talk, let me point some of the ways in which the history I just recounted sheds light on the present situation facing undocumented Mexicans in the United States. A growing number of U.S. citizens are once again resorting to 1970 stereotypes that portray Mexicans as draining welfare and calling for their deportation. Mexican government officials continue to view with favor the departure of Mexican citizens to the United States, and even now have not implemented systems to incorporate those who are being deported into Mexico's economy. U.S. politicians continue to ignore how border fortification in fact increased the number of people residing in the United States. While before 1986, it was primarily men who migrated, and they did so in a circular fashion. After the border became fortified in 1986, entire families migrated and settled permanently north of the border. But this history shows how, by uniting, migrants can improve their conditions and achieve local, national, and transnational recognition, and against all odds. After all, the years between the 1960s and the 1980s are ones which both Mexicanists and U.S. historians describe as ones that saw a rapid political shift from the left to the right, a decline in leftist activism, and the growing demonization of the welfare state. Still, during these years, unauthorized Mexican workers managed to create their own cross-border welfare institutions and to fight for their needs in both countries. Thank you very much. Thanks, everyone. And so now I would love to take some questions, thoughts about the talk, about the book, if you read it.
Please, I'm going to close the door to keep the noise out.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for your presentation. It was wonderful. I really look forward to reading your book. I work on Mexican history. I'm writing my dissertation right now about Cancun, and there's a problem there with migration, bringing people from other parts of Mexico into that region of the Yucatan Peninsula. So I'm wondering, and maybe you address this in the book, if you could talk more about the Mexican dimensions of this story. Why Zacatecas and Michoacan in particular? What was going on there with their political economies during this time period?
That was forcing people to migrate.
Right,
So these were historically areas of high out-migration. They're areas that they're agricultural communities with high levels of drought. So whenever there's a drought, people have to migrate. There's like very little options. There are also communities where during this period, starting in the 1940s, the Mexican government started to implement what's known as the Green Revolution, where it introduced new technologies to modernize Mexican agriculture, such as the use of new fertilizers or irrigation. But it didn't introduce them in every single area. So areas that were not modernized, for example, now had to compete with more modernized areas, which was basically impossible. And not only that, but the areas that were being modernized often needed fewer workers. So that also left workers without a job, which encouraged them to migrate, especially because they had also been doing that. Alongside that, from 1942 to 1964, Mexico and the United States had this program that I talked about, the Bracero Program, which was a bilateral guest worker program through which Mexican workers could come and work for short periods of time. Much of the recruiting for that program happened in those states in the Central Plateau region. Now, once you have people starting to go to the United States, a culture of migration is developed, right? People already know how the United States work. They learn some English. They know where to go. It makes it much easier for them to continue going to the United States afterwards. So in some ways, that helped to promote migration in following years as well. So for all these reasons, those states are the states that were seeing highest out-migration in the years between 1965 and 1986, and earlier as well. And later, it starts to diversify to other parts of the country. But what's interesting is that most people are not thinking about the South, which is a migration that starts later, but they're always surprised that it's not people from northern Mexico that were migrating more. And part of the reason that happens is because Mexico was investing much money in northern Mexico in a way that it wasn't investing in the Central Plateau region, in these western states. Any other questions?
Dean Galvez, can I give you the mic?
Oh, sure. When the husbands of the wives that left and the wives were getting, or more that the husbands were getting concerned about the behavior of the wives, did this sort of intensify an already misogynistic culture, or how did that shift, if any?
We often have these stereotypes about Mexican machismo, and it's very easy to reproduce them. And part of what I'm trying to do here is to say this machismo in some ways is conditional to the structures that occur, and migration was one of the structures that was occurring. So yes, of course, there were some men who were already telling women not to go outside and stuff, but their fear, their insecurities just increased so much. They were like, we're away. What are our wives doing? Let's control them. In a way that beforehand, they didn't have so much insecurity because they were always around. They were seeing what was happening, right? So their insecurities definitely increased when they were in the United States. And so they started to increase their control over women. Now, the way they did it was not just through them, it was through this whole social world that existed, of women in particular who controlled each other's movement. They controlled it through gossip, and they controlled it because women often lived with their parents-in-laws. So the parents-in-laws would not allow their daughters-in-laws to go outside. So it was a very much controlling situation. When men lived in Mexico, they were the ones in control. They didn't have to rely on their parents-in-law. And often women experienced much more liberty, they claimed, before men started to migrate in such high numbers. And I actually think that what thinking about this does is it disrupts the notion that Mexicans are always machista, and show how the structures really affect gender constructs.
Thank you for clarifying.
Thanks so much for the talk, and I also really enjoyed reading your book, and was particularly interested in the appendix section about kind of doing oral history with queer folks and thinking about queer migration. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that aspect of the project and how you approach that, why that's of interest, and how that fits into the story that you're telling.
Yeah, so this project started originally, part of what I was looking at was I was just going around Mexico, and I noticed that in many areas of Mexico, there were a lot of areas that, had a lot of women, had a lot of elderly people. A lot of men had already migrated, but there was a lot of queer men, and I was like, why is there such a high proportion of queer men? Why are queer men not migrating? So at first, it did not start as an oral history project per se, but simply as an observation. And then as I went about it, first, it was the idea of how do I go about meeting people? And it actually proved much easier than I expected it to. I went to churches. Churches was one of the main places where I met people. And although we think of Catholic priests as being homophobic, actually in these towns, everyone was okay with who was gay, who was not. They'd be like, oh yeah, Juanito, Pedrito, and they would introduce me to them. And I was like, oh, hola, Juanito, ¿cómo estás? Like, do you want to talk to me? And actually, they would talk to me, and they would be like, they were fine talking about it, and everyone else in town knew who was gay. So it was actually it facilitated it. In larger towns, where not everybody knows each other so much, the people who did know everyone, I found out, was taxi drivers. Taxi drivers, because they circulate throughout town all the time, because they know everybody. And so I would just hop on a cab and be like, and sometimes I had to play, like I'm fairly like genderqueer looking, and so I'd like play this like, and so I'd arrive to like a group of men, and I'd be like, hi, I'm looking for like gay men, like who of you could take me to, and it was a group of taxistas, and I was like, who could take me? And they were like, oh, he's gay, oh no, he's gay, and I was like, like it was the funniest thing. And then finally it was like, sure, someone was like, sure, I'll drive you around, I'll introduce you to people. So as long as I was like willing to like take their little jokes and like laugh with them, like, and in the end they introduced me, and they were, it's not like, they were homophobic in the sense that they were laughing at being queer, as if that was something to laugh at. But also they were really close friends with the queer men and treated them with respect, So I would just talk to people, and I found it really strange how, originally I found it really strange how people were really open about it, and how priests were. But later I realized, I started looking at more manuscripts, more archival manuscripts, and I realized that this had been sort of part of these communities for a very long time, that this wasn't necessarily new. And that gay men actually had a lot of power in these communities because, as I say in the book, they were able to take jobs that were very highly paid. So women, for example, were florists, but stereotypes would say that gay men would be better florists, so they made a lot more money, which placed them in very economically privileged situations, which in turn gave them a lot of power in their community, right? So that also gave them some respect. So people were willing to talk about it.
Thank you also for this. This was absolutely fabulous. And sort of going along with Adam's question, it sounds like you had a really rich and diverse source base, and I would love to hear about sort of the process of going through everything you found and being able to craft this, and sort of what other projects you think you could and will create out of all this information, and how you chose to privilege what information.
Yeah, that's a really great question. I was interested in two different sets of questions. One is what was happening at the government level in Mexico and the United States, and one was what was happening to people. That's how it first started. And so it was really easy to, separate the chapters. I was like, okay, these are the archives of the Mexican government. These are the archives. And that's how the book is written, and it comes at a cost. Another way that I could have written it is in a much more integrated way of how people experienced government policies, which I think might have been more productive. So it did come with a cost, and that's another way in which I could have written it. Your other question, and then what I did was I started incorporating other dynamics that I wanted. So for example, activism. So I have a chapter on activism. And often, things jumped around. I think the stuff on La Casa del Mexicano was originally in chapter 4, then it came to chapter 2, then it returned to 4, and now it's in 2 again. So it really did change, and there's many ways to write it. But I was trying to form a narrative that was easy to understand for people, that showed all the complexities, but that was also readable.
For a fascinating talk and a very important, groundbreaking book. And I really appreciate how you complicate a history of Mexican migration by centering both the roles of the Mexican government and the U.S. government, right? And I'm intrigued by the argument about how Mexicans are displaced from both Mexico and the United States, but also from the local communities. And your picture, La Casa del Mexicano, made me realize that also while they're being displaced, they find ways to create their own homes, right? By titling it the Casa del Mexicano, the home of the Mexican in this country that is not ours, right? So that's just most an observation. So thank you for connecting those points, right? That have not always been in the forefront of how we understand Mexican migration. But my question is about the role of women who stayed in Mexico. So while men were the main ones who emigrated and were sending money back, right? what was the role of Mexican women? Did they have any say or any leadership roles in organizing how the money sent was being used to maybe do the churches, or not churches, the clinics or other services, or were they not involved at all?
So, unfortunately, most women were not involved at all to begin with, because a lot of the money that was being sent in terms of remittances was being sent to parents, and then the parents-in-law would distribute it to the family accordingly. So they weren't in charge of that money. But what did happen was that in Los Angeles, there is this beauty pageant that is very, very important. Señorita México Los Ángeles. It's a huge pageant. The person who wins has a lot of power. And one year, this one woman, Maria Elena Serrano, who's this lady over there, won Señorita México Los Ángeles. And she was also extremely charismatic. And the leaders of Club Sociales realized that she could help them raise a lot of money. So they made her president, not just of one club, but of the whole federation of clubs. And at that point, she tried to change the position of women within the clubs. Now, it wasn't much because few women were migrating, right? Women were staying primarily in Mexico. But for those women, she did change it for a short period of time. She didn't have much success, but for a short period of time, she did incorporate more women. As I showed there, part of what clubs were also doing, for example, was bringing people such as Ramirez, who's, okay, she's called La Valentina. She's like this woman in the Mexican Revolution who, is known for her gender queerness. And they brought her, and she came dressed in male garb in her full. So they were, in some ways, working with queer gender presentations and changing gender norms in that way. But in terms of the money that was sent, it was men, and the agents in Mexico who were in charge of the money were primarily men. After 1986, women do start taking some positions of power in local communities, but what happens often is that men are in charge of returning home for political positions of the ejido, for example, which are the communal lands. Who's going to rule the ejido if all the men go? You'd expect it to be women, but actually what starts to develop in many communities is that they force a particular man to return to be in charge of working in the ejido, right? So women don't acquire a lot of political power in many communities. In some, they start acquiring more power, particularly in the state of Zacatecas.
Hi. Can you discuss the role of children in your book and what impact moving or not moving and staying in Mexico had, and the role of mixed status families in your book?
Well, there were few mixed status families because for the most part, children were staying in Mexico with their mothers while their men were migrating, right? So mixed status in the sense of more like transnational, more like split. Now we think of split families when someone's deported, but back then the splitness primarily came because the men was migrating. So you talk to all these children who say, I grew up without a father. I saw him coming and going, but he wasn't there. For example, I talked about this guy Camacho, and you talk to his daughter, Karen, and she says, I really resented him. I didn't understand why he was going. She was just a kid. And tons of kids describe the same thing. Now, boys describe something very different, which is that they grew up knowing that they would have to come to the United States. Now, after 1986, of course, children start growing up here. Children who would have stayed in Mexico are now being brought to the United States. So when we think about people who like dreamers, right, who are being said, the dreamers, actually, without IRCA, without the fortification of the border, those children would have probably stayed in Mexico. And it's this law that made it harder for people to cross the border and continue to engage in circular migration that led children to grow up in the United States.
That's a segue to a question I wanted to ask you, Anna. Could you just give us a little sense of the material that you offer regarding struggles for human rights on the U.S. side of the border in places like Arizona and Texas. I'm thinking in particular about the work that you did on the Plyler v. Doe case, which does get to questions around kids and the status of kids, the rights of kids, and the involvement of parents in those struggles in particular. But you also have some wonderful material in the book related to labor rights for migrants in Arizona. And I wonder, as we think about these questions about well-being, if you might just present us, at least briefly, with some of your findings there.
Yeah. So some children did migrate. And part of the struggle that started happening in Texas was that the Texas legislature decided that school districts in Texas could decide whether to allow undocumented migrants, whether to start charging them, or whether not to allow them at all, or whether to just continue welcoming them. So every district could do whatever they wanted, whatever they wanted. And there's one district in Texas, Tyler, where the principal decided that he was going to start charging admission, $1,000 for every undocumented migrant. Now, the kids could not pay that, the parents could not pay that, right? So ultimately, a group of parents whose children were undocumented decided to get together. They went for help everywhere they could. They couldn't find a lot of help originally. Finally, our church members sent them to MALDEF, and lawyers from MALDEF, which was a very important Mexican-American organization, took on their case. And they built a case that ultimately was called Plyler v. Doe. Doe because, of course, the children couldn't use their name, right? That would have been like a form of, like, it would be very easy to retaliate against their families in the small town of Tyler. And Plyler because that was the name of the superintendent of the school. And what was MALDEF put this very important legal brief, and it finally made it to the Supreme Court, and they won. And the judges said, yes, undocumented children can attend school, but they can only attend, but the reason what that we're determining this is because it wasn't, quote unquote, it wasn't the fault of their own. What this language does is that it portrays undocumented children as innocent and undocumented adults as guilty, without realizing the complex reasons why undocumented adults are coming. Now we don't have to fight for children to go to school. We still have to fight for them to get, into college for free, like to get the same amount of grants and benefits to be able to attend college. But we don't have to fight that for public schools, and we don't have to fight that because of Plyler v. Doe. But part of what this law also does is that it criminalized, that it encouraged the language that criminalizes unauthorized adults. But this was a very important struggle. There were other legal struggles that came about. One of the ones that Steve was mentioning was in Arizona. At the time, most migrants were not going to Arizona. They were going to California. 70% of all migrants were coming to California. I'm from Stanford, so now I always say, they're coming here, they're coming to California. They're going to California. But some were going to Arizona, especially from states in Mexico with lower out-migration. So one of the most important states where they were going to Arizona was Guerrero, for example, which at the time didn't have such a high rate of migration. But every year, every season, seasonal workers would go to Arizona and work there. Now, working in Arizona, there were two jobs that existed for farm workers, working in the onion fields and working in the groves, in the citrus fields. The onions paid much better, and it was much easier work, but undocumented migrants could not do it, partially because immigration officials were always circulating throughout Arizona, throughout this area, near Phoenix, and they would see undocumented migrants in the onion fields. But the groves had so much foliage that they could hide within them. So undocumented migrants lived in the groves. They never left the groves. They always lived there. They lived in cardboard boxes or on top of branches when there were snakes to avoid them. They drank water that had fertilizer because that was what was available. The living and working conditions were absolutely dreadful. So one undocumented migrant decided that he wanted to organize these workers. He had joined the United Farm Workers. the United Farm Workers at the time did not support, the United Farm Workers are Cesar Chavez's movement, which at the time was not, this is 1977. At the time, it was very conflicted about whether to support undocumented immigrants or not. Before then, it had been very much opposed to undocumented migrants. So this one organizer, Lupe Sanchez, splits away from the United Farm Workers and decides that he is going to organize these workers in Arizona, in the citrus groves. And the way he does it is he realizes he can't go into the groves. These are private properties. The workers aren't coming out. So what is he going to do? So what he does is he goes to Mexico and organizes workers in Mexico itself. And he can do so because every season, people from the same communities in Mexico would come to these fields in Arizona. So circular migration is a way which connects two very different places and allows him to organize a population that otherwise would have been unorganizable. And not only that, but by being in Mexico, you were asking about women. He meets their wives, he meets the priest talks to the men as well. Everyone convinces the men that it's indispensable that they go and strike the following harvest season. This is really hard for them because the union that Lupe Sanchez organized did not have any strike funds. So the men decide to go and strike, decide to come, cross the border, and strike even without having funds. The grove which they struck at was called Arrowhead Ranch, which was partially owned by the Goldwater family. So it received a lot of media attention. And it was the first successful strike by undocumented workers. So when we're thinking about all these, what you were asking me, Steve, about the different forms of activism, there's legal activism around, whether children can attend schools. There's labor activism that's very direct about about how to organize unauthorized workers, which at the time had been considered to be unorganizable and who were considered to be the strike breakers, we don't want undocumented migrants was the common reasoning because they will come and they will act as strike breakers. So it was the first instance when they said, actually, we can organize them, and we can do so by going to Mexico and organizing them there.
I want to give you the last word. I want to first thank you. We need more the voices of more historians thinking about these things. We're clearly at a moment in our kind of collective histories in North America in which so many of the issues that you're talking about are certainly in the newspaper. They're the subject of Human Rights Watch reports. They're very much on our minds as we think about the well-being of, our neighbors, our neighborhoods, our family members. And as a historian who thinks about this period between 1965 and 1986 and makes what I think is a convincing argument that so much of what we're dealing with today in 2018 was framed by the period that you document in this late 20th century moment. I want just to ask you to close by saying a word, if you can, about how understanding the history from 1965 to 1986 has shaped the way in which you see developments today.
Yeah, so in some ways we think about the history of Mexican migration as thinking, they've always come. But actually, Mexican migration, unauthorized Mexican migration, really starts up and continues uninterrupted until 2008, but it really starts after the end of the Bracero Program. And the reasons why it starts is because people had been given an opportunity to come through the Bracero Program, and that was taken away. So part of what I think is important to think about is how the United States has historically recruited people to come, created a culture of migration, and then when they no longer when the economy or the rhetoric, when they need a scapegoat, they decide to close the door and to blame Mexicans. So that's one of the things that I constantly think about. The other thing that I think about is about how the same stereotypes are repeated over and over again. For example, the idea that migrants abuse welfare. It starts in the 1970s because there's this idea that there's a welfare crisis, but it continues even up to today. So It's just the recycling of stereotypes. And then there is another phenomenon that really interests me, which is this idea that the way populations look really change. So, as I said, up until 1986, it was primarily men who were coming, children were not coming, women were not coming. That switches. And now when we think about migration, we think about families, we think about family separation in the sense of deportations. But actually we're seeing another wave, which is that since 2008, there's a net out migration of Mexicans. Mexicans are not coming to the United States. When we think about these patterns, more Mexicans are leaving than are coming. And that's extremely important to understand, that these waves, that these notion that there are waves of people coming are just not true. Like, Mexicans are not coming, more Mexicans are leaving. And yet it's Mexicans, even though the populations targeted are now primarily Central Americans, they are the ones whose bodies are being targeted. But rhetorically, it's still Mexicans. It was still, we still talk about how President Trump still talks about, I don't want to say we, because I'm not talking about that, but how Mexicans are rapists and criminals, and so that continues to be part of the rhetoric, even though that is no longer the reality. And now, in terms of what I think is the role of the Mexican government, part of what historicizing has made me do is consider the role of the Mexican government. And I'm also extremely interested in seeing what the Mexican government is doing in terms of Central Americans who are going through. And that is what I think we need to be talking about now, how the position of the Mexican government towards Central Americans has changed. And how, so part of what I discovered while doing this research was that the United States told Mexican officials, you want Mexicans to continue coming to the United States? Okay, then close the border to Central Americans. Don't let Central Americans come. Because we're really scared of Central Americans. So if you stop Central Americans from coming, we won't have to take such strong actions at the border, which will obviously also affect Mexicans. Right? So now we can look at that history and say, why is Mexico still criminalizing Central Americans when Mexicans did get criminalized, when that didn't change? So that's part of what I'm thinking about now.
And it seems to me also, one of your major arguments, I guess, is that the Mexican government had historically sacrificed its own citizenry, right? In the name of a kind of modernization project tied to the Green Revolution, and in which it sacrificed the ideals of the Mexican Revolution, to which it professed repeatedly in the late 20th century. So perhaps, what you may be saying is that it may be no surprise, given the Mexican government's failure to live up to the terms of the revolutionary constitution in the late 20th century, that today the Mexican government may be also engaging in a classist politics vis-a-vis Central Americans, a racist politics vis-a-vis Central Americans, a kind of modernization project tied to the United States, and a migration project tied to the migration of the United States, that in a sense does kind of gesture back to the very period in which you're discussing.
That's why he was my advisor. Absolutely.
I did not want to give myself the last word. Join me, though, in thanking and applauding Ana Minian. Thank you, Ana.
Thank you, everyone.